Episode 124 Above Ground Podcast, A Little Bit Stronger with Dr. Michele Finneran PhD.
Disclaimer. The hosts of this podcast, Timothy Patrick and Will Foley, are by no means medical professionals. However, having lived experience with mental illness themselves, they have gained useful perspectives on common mental health issues that some of us struggle to overcome on a daily basis. By sharing their stories, they hope to create connection. By creating connection, they hope to help you find your purpose. And through purpose, we can all begin to build the foundation for positive mental health. This is Above Ground Podcast.
Are you ready to lace up your boots, throw up your horns, and jump into the pit? Then let's stomp the stigmas of mental illness. It's time for Above Ground Podcast. Now, Will Foley and Timothy Patrick.
Hey, what is up, everyone? Welcome to Above Ground Podcast.
Above Ground Podcast, because you can't serve below.
We are joined by Dr. Michele Finneran PhD, who is a clinical psychotherapist in Florida who is in private practice. And she has written a new book entitled Surviving Domestic Abuse, Formal and Informal Support and Services. Dr. Michele, thank you very much for joining the two of us. I figured we would just get right into it because it kind of correlates the whole thing. Sure. Were you called to do the work you do, and what keeps you doing it?
I've always had a very significant interest in mental health and mental health counseling from a very, very young age. The preface for the book is when I was in the early 2000s, I worked in a local jail. And with that local jail, I was working with incarcerated female inmates. And with that being said, I got to really know them on a very personal level. And what I was beginning to realize and uncovered that these inmates were actually victimized and victims of domestic abuse, which actually absolutely blew my mind. So I was kind of floored. I was kind of floored by how, what are we doing here? These are women who are victims and they're in jail. So I started questioning the system in general and the flawed system in general. And I began my dissertation by looking at each system and how the system is effective or ineffective in helping victims abolish their abusive relationships. So I looked at law enforcement agencies and professionals. I looked at mental health counseling, judicial systems. I looked at all different types of systems, formal, which is the professionals, and then informal, which is the personal. So it kind of just really shocked me that I was talking to incarcerated women that were actually victims of domestic violence. So that really I was confused a lot of the time as to what was happening here. So it just brought a sense that I talked to my dissertation chair. I go, we have a really serious issue here. We have a serious problem here that you don't really know until you are exposed to the system, what that is like. So it is a huge problem.
I'm really interested to get the conversation sort of started because this is a mental health podcast, and yes. you one of your specialties is mood disorders and things like that. And I'm wondering where the correlation between a mental health disorder, a diagnosis, and domestic abuse kind of come together. Are there studies? I feel like you have a sociology background because there's a lot of sociology work done in a lot of this data gathering. So,
right. Yes, there is. People that are victims or survivors of domestic abuse, they experience a lot of mental health diagnoses and disorders, symptoms, symptomology, and signs. So it's because of the abuse that they've endured, the PTSD, the diagnosable, the depression, the anxiety, the bipolar, these are just some of the diagnoses that are related to victims who've experienced this type of abuse. And there's also a syndrome that I talked about in the book called the Stockholm syndrome, which it's not a diagnosable disorder, but it is something that is very noted in literature of how the parallels between the Stockholm syndrome and domestic violence victims parallel each other and correlate with each other. So there is a lot of overlap with domestic violence victims, survivors, and their own mental health, just because it's been compromised in so many levels.
I know that there's been a lot of studies done on, different abuse, like sexual abuse and the traumatic things that have happened. Is there a generational trauma that we see correlated through, say, abusers and victims? And is there anything, I mean, anybody can be an abuser, I suppose. Not suppose. Anybody can be an abuser and anybody can be a victim. So it's kind of, is there any correlations as to what maybe leads an abuser to be an abuser, generational trauma, like where there's got to be crossovers in there?
Yes. A lot of it is, there's a genetic component to this a lot of the time. And a lot of the time abusers learn how to be abusers through their either family of origin or their dysfunctional intimate partner relationships. In the book, I discussed how victims sometimes become victims, and a lot of it has to do with several components, but the mother-daughter relationship with victims and survivors is highly important. That attachment is highly important. We talked a little bit about that in the book. So I'm assuming, just having done the research on it, but I'm assuming just the abuser and their relational with their parents or father figure or mother figure is pretty significant in terms of if abuser is going to turn out to be a perpetrator or not. So I think that's kind of, it's an interesting correlation with a lot of the victims that I interviewed had an unhealthy attachment to their mothers. So with that unhealthy attachment, they sought out intimate partner violence partners that were fed that need for them.
Okay. So again, it's about receiving your need or having your needs met in a diabolical way, but it's that twisted part of our needs of us having to have those connections regardless of how bad they are.
Absolutely. And the need is for the women, it's not a physical need. It's not like tangible things like helping financially or helping moving or helping with babysitting. It's more of an emotional, mental, intimate attachment between mother and daughter that is non-existent. And therefore women who have these unattached relationships with their mom tend to fall into the trap of seeking that type of attention or attachment to someone who is potentially violent and abusive.
Wow.
Do you think that a lot of that is subconscious?
A lot of that is learned. These women that have been exposed early in their youth to possible mothers who are victims themselves.
Okay.
So a lot of it is learned. A lot of it is, I think people really underestimate the ability for when parents actually are active in front of their children. And what happens is modeling takes place. It's an unspoken type of learning that happens for the child. And I think really parents really underestimate, they don't really have to do a teaching lesson or they don't really have to say very much. It's really what they do that the child picks up on these modeling behaviors and therefore learn for themselves. So it's really, people really underestimate the power of modeling between the child and parent dynamic.
So if you're shown love in a dysfunctional way, you tend to believe that's how you deserve to be shown love.
Right. And then you feel like that's the only way. The only way, because there isn't another example. When we have your family of origin, we think that is it. We're not exposed to other people's family of origin. So it's just, we believe that to be our truth.
At a young age, but they probably don't realize it. But I guess in a way of almost prevention, maybe early psychotherapy stuff could help curb some of this. Is that possible?
Definitely. I definitely feel like education for the parent is going to be really important early on. And education, and I know school systems are starting to do this a little bit more with everything that's been going on in this society and with the culture. The schools are starting to introduce the importance of mental health and how important it is to safeguard your mental health. And I think early intervention, such as parents really getting into the know, can really help their child to be have good mental health and well-being.
Can we sort of define domestic abuse in the way that we should be defining it? Like, can you give us a definition of what it is? And then we can kind of get into what to look for, and then maybe some tips as to how to handle it if you know something, because we're all about tips and tools on the show, and your book is all about support. So I'm really interested to get some tips out there and stuff. And I kind of want to just see what the definition is.
Okay. So it's any type of emotional, mental, physical, sexual, financial, religious abuse that takes place. And these are just a little bit of the spheres that abuse can manifest. There's also, the abuse where the perpetrator has tendencies to prevent the victim from interacting with their loved ones, isolation, withdrawal. There's all types of different segments. There's in terms of the abuse, but typically it's either sexual, physical, emotional, or mental. And then we have the others that are financial, religious. There's also abuse where there's also neglect as well that takes place with this type of abusive interaction. So there's all different types of ways to define it. Typically, when a person's being abused and they're victim and they're in it, it's sometimes hard for them to, and not discounting victims and not try to make them feel like they're not knowledgeable, but I know when you're in it, I feel like sometimes it's very hard to know that you are in an abusive dynamic. They don't recognize it as being quite abusive. So what happens is they know something is wrong. They just don't know what it may be. So this is where I found out when I did my literature review that a lot of victims really do research what abuse is. And they go on forums and groups to expose themselves to support groups that have similar stories of abuse that they can relate to, and they begin to realize, oh, wow, now I'm starting to learn, I'm starting to understand how this is working and how similar these stories can become. So it's something that is something that can be very overt, like it's something that's very visible and tangible, but it's also abusiveness can also be covert, where it's kind of an underlying, not as visible. And with abuse that takes place, when you are in an intimate partner relationship, you don't typically wake up and punch your partner. It's usually a gradual kind of systemic buildup of tension building and buildup that takes place that happens over time. And it can be very unconscious, and it can be very deliberate.
Yeah, is it true that a lot of abuse comes from just that seeking of power over someone else, or power that wasn't given to the abuser? Is there is there a correlation to searching for some sort of form of power or some fake power that they think they have?
Yeah, there is in the research and academic, there is the power and control wheel that we see with domestic violence. But there's also, the type of perpetrator that is very insecure, hence narcissistic because of, and there's also different characteristical traits. But the power and control wheel is a very real and researched out model. And if you Google power and control wheel, it will pop up the whole visual wheel and each component in the wheel. So it's very documented and well researched in the literature with power and control. But also, what I've been finding out is that the type of perpetrator that's out there that is very insecure personally, and because they're insecure, there is some narcissistic tendencies that take place with the perpetrator. And they do this because they're insecure, but it comes out as being controlling and vindictive and abusive. But the underlining is that they're very insecure individuals.
I actually have a quick question, just kind of a little bit pertaining to that. Just from listening to that, if let's say in a, I mean, I'm sure this is everything's individualistic, but in a, if you could take out one situation of a domestic abuse situation, if let's say that one the spouse, the abuser recognized it, is it possible to go to therapy early on, catch this stuff, and I guess learn to heal and come out like surviving it?
For the perpetrator?
For both, really.
Well, I definitely do not recommend a domestic violence couple, like an abusive couple, going to mutual couples counseling together. Absolutely not.
Okay.
Not okay. So that's not a good idea, because then what happens is the power and control begins to be exhibited in the session, and it becomes unsafe for the victim. So that's not advisable. So instead, having individual sessions, and what I do with my couples counseling to determine if there is abuse going on, I have at least 3 individual sessions with the spouse, and another 3 individuals with the other spouse. And then I try to uncover if there is any form of abuse happening. And if there is, I really, really be careful as to when, timing wise, to put these people, these partners together in a session, because the last thing you want to do for a therapeutic session is to make it unsafe. But yes, I feel like for perpetrators, it's a little bit harder, because for perpetrators, they don't have the insight. A lot of perpetrators don't have the insight to realize what they're doing is abusive. So
okay.
if you don't have a willingness or a desire to change or recognition that there's a problem, it's very hard to make the shift therapeutically. So that's the challenge. And there's a lot of, court systems that, mandate perpetrators to go to anger management. Well, perpetrators don't need anger management. They need like a batter prevention program. And there's a lot of research out there that says that these programs typically don't really work that well. I don't know if they're coming from an anger management model. I don't know what they're doing, but a lot of these batter intervention programs is not really effective as much as they should be. So that's part of the problem, that this is not an anger issue. This is a perpetrator / abusive problem that's going on. So courts really need to get a better understanding of what's really happening here.
Yeah, I think the failing of the system, again, it's a system. So systems don't see emotions. Systems don't see what's attached to anyone involved in the situation whatsoever. So it's like hard for those situations to say, oh, well, you should go to this anger management course, because I don't know. Yeah, that sounds to me more like there's a lot more than anger that's going on there, for sure.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's very, very heartening to me to hear that peer support is so important, because once again, you proved it by saying that domestic violence victims find a lot in peer support. So it's awesome to find out that like our podcast is from the peer perspective, I always call it, because I'm a peer, Tim's a peer, we're all peers. So what questions can we ask as individuals if we suspect something? Like, what are some tools and tips that we can have in our tool belt to have, so we can have something else to look out out for? Because we come across a lot of diverse people. So
one of the things is you don't want to ask a victim or a survivor. So let's distinguish between a victim and a survivor. A victim to me is somebody who's already in the abusive relationship. A survivor has been out of the abusive relationship for some time. So there's the correlation. One of the things is you don't want to ask victims or survivors is, why didn't you leave? Why don't you leave? Why didn't you leave earlier? Obviously, this is not a helpful question because there's so many different variables and components that are not really, it's not a fair question to ask someone who is in a domestic violence situation. So these are questions that you don't typically want to ask victims or survivors that have been in domestic. Why didn't you leave earlier? What made you stay, kind of thing. It's a very intricate, kind of complex dynamic that makes them not want to leave. Things to look for is, personality. If you have a friend, or if you have somebody in your life that you may suspect, you notice some personality changes, some withdrawal, some isolation, some not really wanting to invite the friend over with their relationship, and keeping the relationship kind of hidden because the perpetrator might not like their friends or might not want them to be associated with other people. So there's almost like an emotional disconnect, if you will, from friends. And, being friends with somebody who's a domestic violence victim and survivor can and has been in literature been challenging for their friends, because their friends get overwhelmed sometimes with the amount of stories or experiences of abuse that take place. So it's important if the friend is emotionally empty from hearing the stories, that they take some time out for themselves and really caretake for themselves in order to be fueled up to get their needs met as well. It's taxing because it's hard. It's a twisted kind of feeling that family members and friends go through when they have a loved one that's going through this. Is they're angered at the perpetrator. They're angered a little bit at the victim for having to stay in the situation, and which is not helpful. But there's also fear. There's a myriad of emotions that go into the informal supports who have witnessed and who have experienced their loved one going through this type of abuse. So there's a lot of to the point of where it gets super frustrating for the informal supports, and then they end up not being helpful for their loved ones. So there's lots of things to look out for. There's lots of character traits to look out for a friend or family who is trying to help their loved one through abolishing their abusive relationship.
Sounds like there's a lot of correlations between coexisting conditions too, like comorbidities of mental illness wrapped up in there, and it's because we hear so many people who don't have the supports for mental illness. Is there a lot of correlation in those? Is there a lot of parallels with resources for domestic abuse victims and mental? Is there a correlation between the lack of resources, I should say, for domestic abuse and mental illness together?
Yeah, I think they're becoming more and more viable, these resources, because society is understanding that, particularly since the pandemic, it's the number of domestic abuse violence calls have been totally risen, and a lot of mental health, because of the pandemic, has been risen. 3 areas in mental health that have really been on the rise. So because of this, and because just of what we've been seeing experientially with society and the things that have gone down, such as school shootings, really, really horrendous crimes that take place, mental health is becoming more of the forefront of talk, and it should be. And back in the 80s and 90s, this kind of thing was very much stigmatized. Mental health was very much stigmatized. Going to a psychiatrist or going to a therapist was very frowned upon and down upon. And now people are beginning to realize that if you don't have your mental health, you really don't have anything.
Right. And I'm sorry to cut you off, because you just led into the perfect thing, because we've been saying this now. everyone has mental health. We don't all have mental illness. And that's where we got to get at. We got to get at mental health just like we do physical health. Like that's
Absolutely.
our primary care doctors don't have the time to get to these questions anymore. So,
right. No.
and you kind of opened up a whole kind of Pandora's box for me, because you've mentioned a lot of these issues, and Tim talks about starting this in the education system young, where we have to, and I hear a lot of correlations of the family dynamic that leads to a lot of this. And how do we, if you're not, and you know what, man, I'm going to have to own this word, but if you're not woke enough to know that there's an issue, okay, how do you fix an issue? So how can you fix the family dynamic when your dynamic was fucked, pardon my French, and then you pass that on, because a lot of people come from those dynamics.
Absolutely.
So how do we fix that? Like, is therapy the issue? Is it because, again, we're talking about being able to talk about something that we don't want to talk about, our emotions and feelings. So how do we get into that? How do we start?
Absolutely. I think it's so easy to repeat dysfunctional patterns because they are not just dysfunctional, but they're familiar. That's all.
They're comfortable, right?
They're comfortable. They're comfortable and they're familiar. So that's all. That's what we gravitate to, regardless if it's functional, unhealthy. It does not make a difference. We gravitate to what's comfortable and familiar. It's when you are exposed to something that's dysfunctional or unhealthy, and you begin to. There's a couple of things that might happen. One is you separate yourself and realize, I don't like the way this makes me feel. I do not like how I'm feeling from this. And you are able to stop yourself and say, okay, when you are a young person or a teenager or a young adult, and you have this, you're witnessing all this dysfunction, and you say to yourself, okay, I hate this. I don't like the way I'm feeling from this. I am not going to do this in my family. And therefore you make a conscious choice to reverse the patternistic familiar cycle that you've been exposed to. It's a recognition and it's a disliking of how you are feeling based on what you've been exposed to. That's really, really important, because even though you're exposed to it and it's familiar, if there's not a distinguishing between what is healthy, familiar, and unhealthy, and a discord of not really wanting to repeat patterns and not liking what was done to you in the past, so you're not going to do it in your future. That's how the patterns are broken instead of repeated. That's how they are broken when there's a conscious decision, an awakening, like you said, an epiphany almost, if you will, of saying, okay, so I was treated like this as a child. I didn't like the way I felt. I didn't like the way that I feel now. When I have children, I'm going to reverse this and do what was not what was done to me. I'm not going to do to my spouse or my partner or my children. So it's just really, and you have to have, again, insight, acknowledgement. You have to have recognition, and you have to be awoken to the fact that there is differences here. And not just because you're under your roof is the right way. And it's just because you're exposed to your family of origin doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way. Exposing yourself to different people, different therapies, the best form of therapeutic intervention, the most successful, is medication management and therapeutic intervention. And like you said, primary doctors are really not suited to give medications for psychiatric uses. It's really the specialist really needs to come in. You would go to your primary doctor to get your shoulder fixed. So it's just kind of like the same thing within a medical model. You wouldn't go to a primary doctor to treat a psychiatric disorder either. So really specialize the disorder and use a specialized doctor who's trained in that field to provide the support and the help.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I agree. I've had that same, mindset, outlook, whatever you want to call it, and it's just good to kind of hear it come from a professional.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important to, recognize and expose yourself to different, and, the support is there. The support, like your podcast is a form of support. These resources are out there. It's tapping into them. It's really knowing that there are resources out there that you might have to search for and look for. So it's not too far. The resources are becoming more and more viable and more available. So don't negate saying that you don't necessarily have to go first off to a therapist if that's not what you feel comfortable doing. You can do your own preliminary research and your own type of listening and viewing. And then maybe if you feel like this is something that you can't really manage on your own and maybe need a professional, then you make the decision of whether or not to introduce a network of support, formal supports that can help you. And I think that's really just actually very smart mental health caretaking for.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Smart mental health 101 right here for sure. There's a piece in the book where you had mentioned about there was and forgive me, I don't know the actual wording you used, but it was similar to they don't realize there's a problem until it becomes a life-threatening problem. I feel like that is so familiar with the way that we handle mental health and crisis in particular. It's this Western culture where we wait for that crisis to happen and then go, hey, wow, look at this. We need to do something. So what in your work and learning about this stuff, what is there something that we can do that's more proactive to?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Before it becomes an issue, if you're starting to feel something, a little bit of something before it becomes a crisis, seek the intervention before it implodes. It's like it's listening to your mental health. It's listening to your body. It's becoming more attuned with yourself and really listening to yourself a little bit more deeper and a little bit more intimately, which people do not like to do. And that's part of the problem is they do not like to really sit with themselves and listen to themselves because it's uncomfortable. And that's okay. But I feel like getting comfortable with the uncomfortable kind of needs to happen. Also, I find that people don't like to do that. I experimented a couple of times with doing. It's very, very challenging. It's really like sitting with yourself, like in darkness with absolutely no stimulation, no phone, no dog, no TV, no radio, nothing. Sitting in silence, in dark, alone, just reflecting and thinking. I have to tell you something. It is the most challenging thing to do because we crave those distractions. We crave those stimulations. And so when you shut it down, you are literally shutting everything around you down, and you are able then to tune in to that inner voice. You're able to tune in and more receptive and open to signs that may be experimentally shown to you either on a high level or a universal level, whatever you believe in. So it's really like, I did this one time in my life when I was going through a crossroads in my own life. I really didn't know what to do. And so I really had to really process it and meditate on it. And for about a month, each night I would come home and sit in darkness for about 30 minutes and really just try to visualize what I could see myself doing. No one talking to me, not processing it with anybody, not talking on the phone with anybody, not having the stimulation, but just in my own mind and having that conversation with myself or the universe or your higher power, whatever you believe in, to kind of get the answers that you need. And I did that for about a month. And it just kind of, when I made the actual decision to take a step forward in thought out risk taking process and to going into my own business, that's when the universe met me halfway. And that's when things really started to unfold for me. But I couldn't do that without that time, specific, uninterrupted, unstimulated time that I needed for myself. So people have a very challenging time sitting with themselves. Very, very hard. Very hard.
You've inspired me because I meditate off and on because it's hard for me to sit. I actually my family was cool enough to create me a spot outside for Father's Day with all kinds of accoutrements and statuettes and stuff. Yeah, it's a nice place.
Like I said, like a sanctuary.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. Yeah, it's awesome. But it's getting cold here where we are because we're up in upstate New York. So and I get up early in the morning, but I have the perfect room to sit in darkness. And I've never just tried to sit with no anything around or distract because I always have the cat bugging me or something going on. So I'm gonna have to try that this week now because
it's very challenging. You know, you might want to start off with just like 10 minutes of just like trying to, and you know, and your mind is going to take you all different kinds of places, but really just like redirect your mind to what a focal point is. And I do this. I train myself now that I have learned the mastery of doing this. I train myself to do this each and every day of my life now. In the mornings, I go for an hour and a half meditative walk. It's not a walk to lose weight or to change my size of my clothes. It's really the walk in the morning that's done really early in the morning is a walk with myself, no headphones, no telephone, just a walk with myself with the moonlight, the universe, signs, me just being receptive. But it's a meditative walk I do for myself alone that helps me get my day started. And I'm moving my body. I'm watching my posture. I'm watching my form, and I'm becoming one with myself and having things kind of come to me. And it's amazing when I'm on this walk, the type of things that you brainstorm and come to with just being alone, walking, thinking, and meditating with yourself during this time. It's just the things that I come up with are just like, afterwards I have to come home and take notes. No, it's slowing down your mind, the racy mind, the ruminating mind, slowing it down.
That's the most important part. And I'm glad you kind of brought that up because a lot of people have a misconception of, that you hear the word meditation and it kind of even scares people away. But you said something that I've said before it's meditation is actually just bringing your mind back when it wanders. It's bringing it back to that focal point. And
absolutely.
Awareness is everything. Awareness is everything. And when you can get to that point, again, you can do a quick body scan.
Right.
Your shoulders, why am I, keeping my shoulders like this and clenching my fists? Let go,
Yeah. And that's something when I had fallen one year, and I had fallen on my hip, which was already had problems with. I went to a neurologist, and she diagnosed me with having sciatica, which brought up a whole nother level of pain that I never experienced before in my life. Being 46, having a hard time going up and down my stairs is a really big problem. So she told me what to do in the midst of this. And, I was taking medications for a little bit, but then I don't want to do that forever. So I got into some Vinyasa yoga, and that really did help with my whole kind of hip flexors and sciatica. And now I'm always kind of in the realm of tweaking and modifying my physical health, because the mental health and the physical health and the spiritual health, the financial health, and the relational health all just kind of go hand in hand. They all kind of feed into each other. These spheres work miraculously with each other. So if you can master one sphere, I'm a firm believer, if you can get down one sphere, you can master each sphere. It's just having what can you master the most, and then they're transferable skills, so you bleed them over to the next sphere, and by then you're going to be the best version of success that you could possibly be. And that's the ultimate goal, right? We want to be better than we were yesterday, than we are today for tomorrow. So that's really the goal here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
We Will and I both, we've said this is all, it's all interconnected. We've said it,
Yes.
We say it all the time, that it's
You guys
all
are on
interconnected.
you guys are on the right track, because it's very, very true. Research has shown it. Statistics have shown it. This is not just something that a therapist fluke is bringing up. This is actual like research oriented stuff that has been looked at academically, not just by Google. Google's not research. Google is other people's opinions. I'm talking about academic literature, journal reviews, research books. I'm talking about academia, not Google, not Siri. Well, that's one thing that I'm still trying to master is really like scanning my body and listening to what my body's telling me. For all my life, I've been just like muscle through it, muscle through it, muscle through it. And you do that, you end up getting hurt. You end up getting injured. You end up having some sort of problem, and that stops you dead in your tracks. So I've stopped that mentality of just muscling through it and really, really listening through it.
Right. You can't just muscle through. You got to listen.
I think it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. In this culture, we wait for that, we wait for the knee to blow out. We wait for the shoulder and your neck, and maybe now I'll go to the doctor, or I'll go see a chiropractor. I don't know why that is, but you're right on. Absolutely. Yeah.
We are a culture that is very reactive and not preventative and not proactive. And that's just, that's the reason why we have flawed systems. They're very reactive systems. And that's what I saw in the legal system. That's what we see kind of in the medical system. That's what we see, that the reactivity is high when there's a catastrophe. And that's really typically not the best way to learn, because now you're emotionally in crisis. And when you're emotionally heightened, there is no logic or rationality that comes into play, or problem solving that comes into play. So it's when you're emotionally leveled, diffused, that things can kind of get done.
Wow, very well said. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
You're welcome.
It's been an amazing hour almost. I can't believe it. We usually finish. Tim, is there anything else you want to kind of wrap up before, or do you just want to get into questions? Because it's yours first. So
no, it's okay. I guess I just want to ask Dr. Finneran, maybe if she could just, if she has anything, left to say, or where, if she can tell our listeners where they can find her book, anything like that.
Absolutely. One thing that I do definitely want to say that I think is important is really just cherishing and harvesting the relationship with self. I think we have these impeccable relationships with other people. The one relationship that we really need to hone in on and really, really harvest and foster is the one with self. And if we can't do that, then we really don't have the ability to do it with anybody else. So I want to just say that the self-love and the self-value and the self-esteem and self-worth is really important, just with that relationship with self. And it is an intimate relationship with self. It's not just a surface. It can't be just a surfacey day-to-day dynamic with oneself. It has to be a deep, meaningful love, an unconditional love, regardless of where you are in your journey, that acceptance and that grace is always there for yourself, that you put in place for yourself. I think that's one thing that I definitely want to hone in, because I think that goes pretty much unturned a lot of times. So people, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. That's our last 4 months has all, this is why I'm back in therapy. This is seriously, this is self-love has been I realized, that my core belief is that I'm unworthy. So it's I'm building it back through it. I'm writing letters to my childhood self. I'm doing all these things, and it's and it feels good. And it's actually bringing things back from my childhood that I did as a kid that I didn't think were beneficial at the time, because I was just playing or having a good time. But I realized that there was a benefit to them too.
Absolutely.
And it's self-love is so important. And I think we have a new mission at Above Ground Podcast that's all about self-love. So thank you so much. It's been awesome. You're awesome.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So people can reach me on my website it's www.drmichellefinneran.com. If you just Google Dr. Michele Finneran, I come up on the website, and you can see I have a whole website that goes over my services, that goes over a way you can contact me, that goes over the feel good blog that I have on there that is educational and informational.
Cool.
And there are also some videos on the website that you can actually look as well. And then on Instagram, it's Beck Counseling, V as in Victor, ECC Counseling. And then there's Facebook, it's Dr. Michele Finneran comes up, and then that you can see kind of like my platform and the videos that are done and that I put on and the testimonies that I discuss. So it's informative, it's educational, and that's the purpose of that. So if anyone wants to reach me, I can only do therapeutic intervention in the state of Florida because that's where I'm licensed. But in terms of business collaborations, like we have, like on ourselves that we just did recently, it's anybody can contact me through Instagram, through my contact form on my website. So
we like Will said, we usually end up ending the episode with 3 questions. Do you have a favorite or a least favorite word?
I can't really, I don't think that because it's the least favorite word, I don't want to really say it. But yes, I do. I have a least favorite word. It's not nice. It's not a nice word. And because it's not nice, I don't think it's appropriate.
What letter does it start with? We might be able to figure it out.
C. Let's start to C.
Okay, that's what I kind of figured. Okay, well, we got that one.
Yeah.
All right, I get it.
I don't like that word at all. And that's why I can't even come to say it. It's like so hard. But I mean, that's why it's just not a good word for me.
All right.
And probably for most women.
Yeah, I would think so. Think so. How about a favorite word?
Empowerment. That's a favorite word. I love the word empowerment.
I love empowerment. Empowerment's become one of my favorite words lately too, because it's like, that's what we're doing. Like, this is empowerment.
Yes.
This is self-empowerment, but it's also a power plant to send out the energy. So the next question is kind of lighthearted. And do you have a favorite preference for animal, cat, dog, or other?
Oh my God. A dachshund dog is my favorite. Is my favorite. It's a dog. It's we've had 2 dachshunds. Me and my husband have 2 dachshunds, and they're the hot dogs. They're the little wiener dogs. But oh my God, I love these dogs. And my husband is the one who has introduced me to these types of dogs. But we have a dog. She's a dapple dachshund, which she's spotted. She's like 3 different colors, and her name is Miss Daisy May. And she is absolutely the funniest dog I've ever encountered in my youth and growing up in my life. We have her in the middle of our floor, and she just is a source of entertainment for us. She's so funny. Oh my gosh, dog's hysterical.
That's awesome.
We love this dog. Yes, so funny.
We can't tell that you guys love it.
Yeah, no, I can't tell. I asked that question because I love to see the expression on people's faces when they talk about their pets. Because they're such a source of love and such a source of just like grace, because because they don't care.
Strength.
Yeah, and strength. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the last question we have is, if you could do anything, or if you would like to see anything done for mental health as a whole without any restrictions, what would it be?
Oh gosh, that is a loaded question. I think I'm talking on a micro level, micro, meaning small. There's micro and there's macro. So on a micro level, I just want individuals to really, really understand that the stigma is gone, the labels are gone, and it's really about like having that self-acceptance and individualistically working on your mental health. There is absolutely no shame in the game. There's absolutely no embarrassment. There has to be a level of just wanting to get this taken care of for yourself so you can be the most productive individual in your life. On a macro level, these systems that we talked about need to be reworked. They need to be reworked and fixed macroly on a bigger scheme things. I like to present myself on a more macro level versus an individualistic micro level. I think the more people I'm able to reach, or more people that in the field can reach, the better, on a macro level. So that's really what I'm trying to do in terms of writing and educating and publishing. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a forum for a macro level audience that I can reach. And that's my goal.
I'm sure you've reached hundreds, but I can definitely tell that you have two new people that you definitely reached today, and that's Will and myself. So thank you so much, Dr. Finneran, for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Tim and Will, for having me. Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure such good energy and good vibe I get from you both. And I just really have enjoyed myself this Sunday morning.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here. I can't thank you enough, because you just kind of hit the nail on the head about micro versus macro. Because like the micro level for us is our self-love, but the macro is the community that we're able to touch. And we're fortunate that we're able to touch as many people as we can, because we touch people all over the place, which is kind of funny now in this day and age that you can talk to people on the other side of the planet.
Absolutely.
Pretty regularly. So thank you very much for being here. Can you just hang out for 1 second while we wrap this up? Timmy, another good one, man. Wow. Yeah, so much.
Formal and informal supports and services.
That's what I think we provided here. And I think Dr. Michele did not let us down for that one, for sure.
Not at all.
So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Don't forget to check us on the socials and follow us, like us, hit the notifications, all that kind of stuff. And if you like what you're hearing, you can donate to the show at PayPal. I include all the links in the show notes. All of Dr. Michele's links will be in the show notes also. So until next week, be well.
Be safe.
And be strong, and be
above.
Oh.